you mentioned agile transformation as a side comment earlier, and I wanted to get back to that from the perspective of cultural change and going through a transformation, because when we think about strict proprietary processes and either inner source or open source, that's a different setup and way of working together. And at least I personally do have the experience of agile quote unquote transformation within a company where we were practically building a newish organization, and we were told by the time I got there that it's going to be agile, whatever that is. And when it comes to external communications, we were doing agile. Now, if you were internally involved, what that meant in practice was think about the waterfall development method and just relabel everything with agile terms. And that's what they were actually doing. And it was very, very painful. In my experience, like this little bit of lying to ourselves was way more harmful than actually doing something that people did not have the experience with yet. So this kind of pretending to do one thing while we are still doing the other thing under the hood, that was just the worst thing that can happen. However, transition periods are usually hard. So I wanted to ask what your experience is in terms of that transformation period where maybe not everybody's bought into the concept. Like, is it management who may not be, or have you seen like developers, engineers struggling with taking on the new concept? So what was your experience with that?
Yes, now I'm, and as I say this, I'm going to very explicitly say this is just the feedback that I've gathered from the InnerSource Commons community, as opposed to kind of personal first-hand experience. So, with that anecdotal caveat, I would say I think it's really interesting. The InnerSource movement, I suppose, maybe differs from the Agile movement in some respects. I mean, I don't think anyone in InnerSource Commons would say that it's all figured out yet, that we know exactly how to do it. I'm thinking about even our patterns practice in the community, because the patterns practice is so powerful, because you have maybe a couple of different ways to do a particular thing or to encourage your organization to do InnerSource depending on your context. So there's a lot of emphasis in the InnerSource Commons community about this idea of experimentation, and this idea that, one of the principles of the community is that we will document a pattern, try to encourage people to share their experiences of using that pattern, so that we get this idea of how it operates in context, without making a declarative statement to say, you always need to do this. This is the only way to do it. And this person has to do this all the time, right? And I think that's been a very useful way for the community to not come across the kind of sometimes if you say there's only one way to do this, and now we're going to have a principal fight about who in the organization is going to do this one task, because the book says this and we're doing this, and now we're going to fight about that. In the InnerSource Commons community, it'd be more along the lines of, this thing needs to be done. How do you do it? Who in your team does it? And there's a little bit of kind of, well, you could do it this way if you've got these sort of people, or you could do it this way if you've got these sort of people. But it's sometimes the task that needs to be done, and the cultural differences from organization to organization, even from team to team within organizations, can be very different. Now, of course, it's very beneficial to have a consistent way of approaching things. But what I will say is that, sometimes it's a balance. Sometimes if you come in too hard with, we have to decide the one way we're going to do this, and this means everyone has to change, except that one person who we picked as the example of how to do it, that can be very difficult for people. And sometimes, therefore, I think from a cultural perspective, and in order to ensure the best possible success, it can sometimes be more beneficial to pick a pilot project, try it out, observe about whether that will scale, what would be the blockers to scale, are these activities that we're doing in this pilot project scalable across the organization. So everyone in InnerSource Commons would definitely, I think, recommend that idea of gradually scaling a practice rather than coming in one day, like figuring it all out beforehand and coming in with a, day zero, we're all doing it this way, and now your role is this and your name is this, and all of that sort of thing is possibly, I think, what people have attempted with agile transformations. It's kind of like, and then we bring in a whole load of consultants, by the way, to tell us what we're doing wrong and how they're going to fix it for us. But that's not what's happening, I think, in terms of InnerSource practices. They are more evolutionary. There's emphasis on sharing feedback about what's working, what's not working, and accepting that may not always be perfect. And I think that's healthy. For me, that helps people come on the journey and be part of deciding what is the best practice for your organization, as opposed to having someone come in and tell you this is the way it is. And that cultural difference of being involved in the change process, I think, can be very, very helpful.
So kind of we could say that based on what you saw in InnerSource Commons, there are goals in terms of where an organization would want to get with things like openness, being able to share a work item, achieving collaboration outside of a team or an organization, and becoming more like company wide. So you can set up goals, but how you get to achieving those goals, inner source and open source can be more flexible and sometimes I assume forgiving as well compared to things like the more rigid processes. So we can say to focus on goals and kind of figuring out what kind of culture you would like to have within an organization. I did see developers struggle with the whole open source concept because it's just for them it's something that has been too hard to digest in terms of they had the proprietary workflows and ways of working, and all of a sudden they have to do things in public. They want to retain control, and letting go of that or just opening up the boundaries is just not trivial. So kind of sometimes it feels like that if you had an actual system that you could tell them that this is exactly what you do, then maybe it would be easier to get them to get there. But at the same time, it sounds like that we need to focus on kind of end results and then figuring out what's the best way to get there.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think there's enough emphasis put on that kind of psychological reaction to change that you've just described there, like people wanting control. People, I mean, there's a psychological framework I've sometimes presented on, which I learned when I did a coaching diploma, and I learned it. I remember reading about it. It was David Rock's SCARF model, and it talks about the triggers we have about what generates fear in people, the social circumstances that generate fear, and things like status and certainty and autonomy and relatedness and ideas of fairness. If you threaten any of those, people literally will react emotionally, like, fight, flight, or fight kind of response. And I remember reading that and learning about it and thinking, that is pretty much every change situation I've ever initiated. Like, no wonder people were like acting weird. It's not a rational decision at some point. It's like you're threatening what people know, how they've always worked, what they perceive to be their expertise. You're telling them someone else's can actually impact the code that they feel it's their baby. It triggers all sorts of things. And yeah, so I think people have to be very careful about that, first of all. And then, as you say, like, the worst thing to do is to kind of go, this is just the way it is now, because this thing here says so, and this is your new role. Like, that's a death knell to any kind of change program. If it's not going to be explicitly reacted against, it's going to be subverted in some way, because people just don't like that sort of stuff. Now, I will say, I mean, in the inner source, we do have roles defined and things like that. I just think that there's, as you say, there's space for people to experiment with different ways of implementing it. And I personally think to make change sticky, you need people to like the journey. Because if it's too painful, they'll just give up. And who wouldn't, to be fair.